IVM.
Yuddha is for adults. It contains graphic depictions of violence against humans and animals. If you feel you'll be triggered by the accounts of violence in this podcast, it's best you skip through those bits. That said, on to the episode. Sometime more than 200 years ago, a bunch of early geologists in Europe were having a blasphemous debate. I say blasphemous because the one thing that they all agreed upon was that the Earth, this planet we live on, was not a mere few thousand years old, like the Bible said it was. The Earth was in fact older, much older. But on everything else, these guys disagreed. On the one side, you had the catastrophists. They pointed to evidence of mass extinctions, great beasts that once walked the Earth but now only existed as old fossils. Surely these great dyings were the product of some great disaster. Surely the great towering mountains, the deep gorges, the continents separated by vast blue oceans were all offsprings of some cataclysmic event, great floods, erupting volcanoes, earth-shattering quakes. On the other side, you had the gradualists. They looked at the world around them and only saw the most gentle, the most imperceptible change, really. The world was ancient, perhaps timeless. Every sandy beach was once a rocky coast. It took millions of years and billions, perhaps trillions of crashing waves to beat the rock into sand. These guys talked in time spans that made humans irrelevant. Was there even a beginning to this Earth? Or was it eternal, always circling the sun? Of course, we now know that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. We also know that the catastrophists and the gradualists were both right in their own way. The old debate is over. We now know of continental drift, and we also know that asteroids have periodically smashed into the Earth, setting off mass extinctions and changing the face of the planet. I'm only talking about geology here because there's an enduring debate in history. Is the world we live in, the shape of our nations, the languages we speak, who's rich, who's poor, all the product of some sudden revolutionary change, something painful, even catastrophic? Or is it the result of slow change over the generations and the centuries? Few of us today doubt that events matter, that the great wars matter, that great personalities matter, that they shape our world as much as long-term forces like economics or social progress or scientific understanding. Rather like geologists today who understand that both catastrophe and gradual change shape our world, we acknowledge that the present is shaped by both big events and the accumulations and the erosions of earlier generations. The big difference, of course, is that in history, we're not talking about inanimate objects. We're talking about human beings, living, breathing, dying people. The stories of how people would congeal together into groups or disintegrate into nothing. How they would be destroyed by catastrophe or just hurled aside by history. How some would benefit from the same catastrophe. All these stories are filled with glory and tragedy, hope and despair, of dreams fulfilled and dreams shattered. In this episode and the next, we're going to be talking about a cataclysm and what it meant for real human beings. The cataclysm, the great volcanic eruption that we're going to be talking about, is the explosion of the Turk and Mongol peoples out of a remote corner of Central Asia. The effects of this eruption, its convulsions, were felt all over Central Asia, across the Middle East, and across India. It's a story of how the sudden and catastrophic collided with the resilient and gradual, and how that collision created the Indian subcontinent as we know it. It's a story of conquest and subjugation, destruction and creation. Above all, it's a story of war.
Welcome to Yuddha, the Indian military history podcast. I'm Anirudh
And I'm Aditya Ramanathan.
So, in the last episode, guys, we spoke about the Rashtrakuta Emperor Govinda III and how in the early 9th century, this young man had basically led enormous armies of South Indians up north, had invaded the Gangetic plains and had sacked many of their cities and had paused at the Ganga, at the Prayaga, the Sangam, or the mingling of the waters of the Ganga and Yamuna rivers. Now, I'd like to imagine that Govinda III, when he was there, would obviously have suffered some sort of losses. He would have had to rebuild his cavalry forces as such, and North India, especially some place along the Ganga and Yamuna rivers, would have been a great place to do that, because we know from contemporary inscriptions, from a number of contemporary sources that Central Asian horse traders did actually come to North India at the time, that there were these great emporia where kings would have had access to military men, labor, material, and so on and so forth. And it's quite possible that some anonymous Central Asian horse trader, whose name we will never know, of course, was there, happened to interact either with Govinda himself directly or with one of Govinda's officers, and happened to sell him a consignment of Central Asian horses. Now, I'd like to imagine that you are accompanying this Central Asian horse trader. You have a nice little pouch of coin jangling with golden Rashtrakuta coins, dinaras as it were. And now you're heading back along the Ganga and Yamuna rivers. You're planning to head up through the Punjab, and you know that eventually you will once again see the great sea of grass that connects, that dominates the geography of Eurasia. So Aditya, over to you. As our Central Asian friend is moving up to his homeland, what does he see?
Well, it's a really amazing geography. Once he crosses the Yamuna, he reaches a patch of plains which is not really watered by any snow-fed rivers until he reaches the Punjab, which is 5 rivers. And when he crosses the very last of these rivers, the mighty Indus, he comes across another patch of plains but can see the snow-clad mountains right ahead of him. And he makes his way through the Khyber Pass.
Where so many armies have come through and where so many armies will continue to come through.
Exactly. And the Khyber Pass is just about to get interesting, in fact. And he then makes his way through Afghanistan, through mountains, through fields, meadows. He crosses the Amu Darya, the Sir Darya. And further ahead, he finally reaches, Anirudh, what you talked about, that sea of grass, the Steppe. It's a world of endless fields of green grass and usually clear blue sky, not a cloud in sight. This is a very dry world, very far from the sea, the actual sea. And soon it's going to be winter, and ice and snow are going to cover the land. And you know, for all the grass that grows in the steppe, it's not a land that's conducive to agriculture. The weather is too harsh, it's too dry, the soil is usually too thin. The steppe is really good for one thing, just one thing. It's the ultimate pasture land. Over here you'll see sheep, you'll see goats, and you're going to see horses. Our trader, everywhere he looks around him, is going to see these young men riding on little mares, herding large numbers of horses. And these horses are not necessarily the biggest ones around, but they're very hardy, they're tough, they're practical. And for soldiers, these are really some of the best horses around. And our trader knows that they're going to fetch a good price. So he just buys as many as he can, and he takes them south. But let's say he decides he doesn't want to go back and sell these horses to the Rashtrakuts. He wants to maybe go try his luck in the markets of Bukhara or maybe further south in Isfahan. As he goes through these places, he's going to see a very familiar sight. All around him, everywhere, are these communities of Turkic-speaking peoples. These people have really expanded over the last few centuries out of the Great Steppe and are now in the borderlands between the sedentary civilizations and the nomadic lands. They are interacting, they are trading, and they are also being recruited as soldiers. Why would they be recruited as soldiers? Well, just consider the lifestyle of these people. As soon as the sun rises, they're on horseback, they're taking their animals grazing, they seem glued to their horses with no sign of discomfort. The Turks are always ready to hunt or to fight, and the two things aren't very different for them. Many of these men have a quiver of arrows hanging to one side of their horses. They also carry these very beautiful composite bows, which are made from horn and sinew and wood that are laminated together. And most of these bows are also recurved, which means that if you didn't string it, the bow would curve the other way. Basically, the composite bow can store a lot of energy, as much or more energy than a lot of larger bows that are made from simpler materials. And what's really special about the composite bow is that it allows men on horseback to become deadly archers. Now, of course, these Turks aren't doing anything terribly new. They're following the old traditions of the steppe. The nomadic lifestyle and the composite bow are really old. And many people have done this, but the Turks seem to come with a new energy. And the caliphs in Baghdad used to once fight these Turks, but now they want them as their soldiers. They're so impressed with their fighting prowess that these Turks have started to serve in large numbers in their armies. There's an Arab chronicler by the name of Al-Jahiz, and he wrote a book titled The Virtues of the Turk. And he actually describes a lot, in glowing terms, the great skills and the strengths of a Turk. And he's really struck especially by the relationship that the Turks have with their horses. Here's a wonderful quote. The Turk is more skilled than the veterinarian and better at teaching his mount what he wants than the most skilled trainer. He bred it, he raised it as a foal. It followed him when he called, and it galloped behind him when he galloped. If you sum up the life of a Turk, you'll find that he sits longer on the back of his mount than on the surface of the earth. When the Turk rides a stallion or mare and sets off on a raid or a hunting trip, the mare and her foals follow him. If he is unable to hunt people, he hunts wild animals. If thirsty, he milks one of his mares. If he wants to rest the one he is riding, he mounts another without touching the ground." Unquote. So this, I think, tells us about how intimate the relationship is between these Turkic nomads and their horses. And, it's not like one man, one horse. One man has multiple horses, usually 5, 6 of them. We should understand here that a lot of the attraction about the Turks comes out of the idea that nomadic people, especially steppe nomads, are just fundamentally tougher than sedentary people who grew up on farms. This is a very old idea, and Al-Jahiz also tells us, he's full of stories about how these guys are tougher. At one point, he talks about how, he gives a very funny description about a marching on campaign. And he describes the usual sedentary people and their attitude. By midday, they're exhausted. He describes them as walking bow-legged like a boy needing to urinate, groaning, yawning, and lying down in the camp. And at the same time, he describes how the Turk has already traveled twice as much and is still busy galloping after wild ass, gazelle, or foxes. Now, one other reason that the caliphs are so interested in hiring these guys is that they don't have kinship links within the system. So this is what in modern political science or social science parlance we'd call coup-proofing, where you want to have a trusted guard of soldiers who don't have allegiances to anyone except you. And a lot of these are, of course, slave soldiers or gulams. And it doesn't really work out as well as the caliphs expect, because these guys eventually seize power of their own.
Surprise, surprise.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting that you brought up Isfahan, Bukhara, because this is a very interesting time to be in the Islamic world. In many ways, this is really the Islamic golden age. This is when Islamic polities really dominate the world, politically, economically, intellectually. When you have Arab travelers who are visiting India, writing great compendia, you have Arabs sitting in Baghdad, revisiting the great works of Plato, Aristotle, all the great Greek philosophers, teaching mathematics and so on and so forth. It's an extraordinarily cultured time, very, very different from the popular stereotype that a lot of people often have about the Islamic golden age. But you mentioned, Aditya, how the caliphs are interested in bringing the Turks in because it's also a very politically unstable time. This is tied into a lot of very complex factors. At this time, the caliphate is controlled by a dynasty called the Abbasids. Now, the Abbasids emerge onto the scene in the late 8th century, and they have a couple of decades of extreme prosperity. There's a lot of reasons for that. We have a podcast about it that we recorded a while back, which we'll link to in this description. But the essence of their success was due to the fact that they unite the great fertile regions of Egypt with the regions of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in Mesopotamia, along with the relatively urbanized regions of Syria and so on and so forth. So basically you have both agrarian productivity and economic productivity. And because, of course, as we know by this point, the Arabs had been very militarily successful, you have an extraordinary concentration of new wealth that has come down to Baghdad, in the new Abbasid capital. And of course, since Baghdad is just upriver of the Persian Gulf and via from there into the Indian subcontinent, these couple of centuries are really when you start to see India becoming more and more connected to the global economy. But of course, as you can imagine, controlling this vast polity which stretches from Central Asia in the northwest all the way till Spain in the far west is more easily said than done. And as a result, the Abbasids tend to appoint families of hereditary governors who, because they're so distant from the political center of power at Baghdad, often set themselves up as, basically local warlords. And there's a lot of other interesting stuff happening as well. You keep mentioning Turks, but it might be a little surprising to a lot of people to hear that these Turks aren't from Turkey. These Turks are from Central Asia. What you had in Turkey at the time was the Eastern Roman Empire or the Byzantine Empire. And the Byzantines are, in my opinion, another extremely fascinating polity because they kind of straddle the gulf between East and West. In a lot of ways, one of the reasons why it was not so easy for Muslim armies to conquer Europe was because you had this powerful state there which claimed the legacy of imperial Rome. And in a lot of ways, was extremely innovative, extremely modern, led by some very, very fascinating characters who have very complex relationships with the caliphs. I came across one caliph who was supposed to have offered a treaty of eternal peace to the Byzantine emperor in return for him sending Constantinople's most famous mathematics lecturer to live in Baghdad for 1 year. And it says a lot about just how important intellectualism and learning is to these people. But at the same time, as I mentioned, because of this decentralization that's happening, you have a lot of powerful new families rising. And for example, you have the Tulunid family in Egypt. You have the Idrisis and Aghlabids in northern Africa. And of course, you have a new dynasty called the Fatimids who are hanging out in North Africa and claiming to be descended from Ali, the son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, I'll come back to the Fatimids in a little while. But to me, the most interesting things that were happening in the Islamic world at this time, though of course it's a relative thing since there's a lot of really interesting things happening, was in Persia, where you see a number of dynasties very often coming from absolutely nothing. There's one, for example, the Safarids, who were founded by the apprentice of a copper merchant. Now, these guys are not to be confused with their contemporaries, the Samanids, and I tend to mix them up quite a lot. These guys basically made their names by fighting against the Buddhists of Gandhara or northern Afghanistan and essentially slaughtered and sacked their way to fame. And in a lot of ways, the Samanids really set up a pattern whereby new families can essentially rise to predominance within this world. Because technically speaking, the caliph, as intellectual as he is, as inclined as he might be towards learning and so on and so forth, must recognize those who are champions of the faith in whatever way. So you find a lot of new upstart dynasties who are now sitting in Persia, which is at this crossroads, if you think about it, between the fertile heartlands of Mesopotamia and the teeming militaristic, warlike lands of Central Asia, who now have access to these Turks, and in that sense act as a conduit basically for the Turks to come into contact with the broader Islamic world. One really great example are the Buyids. The Buyids are fascinating because they're Shias, but we have to keep in mind that we keep saying Islamic world, but there are many, many, many Islams. So I mentioned the Fatimids, for example. So the Fatimids are Ismaili Shias, whereas the Buyids are 12er Shias. Why are the Buyids 12er Shias? Because even though Zaidi Shias were the big deal in Persia at the time, the Zaidis would have forced the Buyids to set up basically a descendant of Ali, who was the Prophet Muhammad's son-in-law, as his imam. And the Buyid king wasn't really into that, so he decided to make himself a 12er Shia instead, which believed that the last imam had magically disappeared and would eventually come back at the time of the second coming of Christ, and so on and so forth. So as you can see, it's a very complex world. It's a very religiously complex world, very religiously diverse. And the Buyids also, they're Persians. They're trying to lean into this old Persianate culture, this old culture of imperial Iran. So they call themselves Shahinshah, which is something that we'll definitely come back to in a later episode of this podcast. But keep in mind, yes, so basically TLDR, it's a complicated world, a lot of really interesting things happening. And what really introduces the Turks to the Middle East proper, into Mesopotamia, is the fact that though there had been peace between the Byzantine and Abbasid empires for most of the 9th, 10th centuries, one particular caliph decided to make a name for himself by breaking a peace treaty and going back to war with the Byzantines. And since he didn't really have the manpower to do that, he decided to hire himself a large number of Turks. And though it worked out for him very well, it didn't work out that well for his descendants, because now you essentially have a wild card that's been introduced into Mesopotamian politics, along with all these powerful dynasties such as the Buyids and all the other great emirs of Mesopotamia, who all want to make the caliph their own, which leads to something called the Anarchy at Samarra, which is a very brief period in time where you see a rapid, brutal succession of 4 caliphs, because all these generals and warlords basically kill any caliph that doesn't agree with the way that they're doing things. So it's a very violent time, very politically volatile. And it's into this mix that you start to see another new dynasty in the late 10th century setting out to make a name for itself by going to war with the so-called enemies and infidels. And these guys are the Ghaznavids.
Yeah, this is, like you said, a story of constant fragmentation. The Ghaznavids get their name because one of the Samanid generals, Alptigin, went basically charging into Ghazni, a town in Afghanistan, and set up his own semi-autonomous fiefdom. Samanids in general, and the Ghaznavids in particular, were very dependent on Turkish gulams or slaves. How would this work? Well, when we talk about slaves, we should be very clear that this is very different from the sort of slavery that we are normally used to hearing about. This is not transatlantic slavery. For one, these people are heavily armed, and that's the point. So it's completely different that way. They also live in close quarters with their masters, and they seem to develop familial relationships. It's not uncommon for a favorite slave to marry the daughter of his master, as we'll see. And these slaves actually are not necessarily terribly unhappy with their condition. Now, being enslaved by itself can be a traumatic experience. These are usually children, young boys who are maybe kidnapped in a raid by a neighboring tribe and then sold into slavery. So that part is traumatic. But at the same time, military slavery gives you an opportunity to materially and socially advance in a way that you would never have if you were just stuck in your pasture land with your sheep and your tents. This is a way to open the world to you. But of course, even that comes at a price, because we know from a lot of sources, including literature, that it was not uncommon for these young boys to be sexually assaulted, often by their masters, by others. There are a lot of references that will make you squirm regarding the beauty of these boys, for instance, in Persian poetry. But if you made it through adulthood, and along the way you learned the skills of a warrior, you learned how to navigate the complexities of the court, you learned how to lead men, well, the world was your oyster. Mm-hmm. Now, we talked about Alptigin. Alptigin himself had a very prominent slave named Sabuktigin. And when Alptigin died, this Sabuktigin took the reins of power in Ghazni. He even married Alptigin's daughter. And this guy would also claim to have royal blood running through his veins. His claim was that back in the day of the Arab conquest of Persia, the old Persian monarchy had fled into fled into the grassland and had married into his old Turkic family. So, this guy already has royal pretensions. Sabuktigin himself had been a slave. He had been captured at the age of 12. And he had obviously learned from his master. There's a wonderful quote from a much later chronicler who talks about how Sabuktigin, quote, widely spread out the carpet of justice and rooted out injury and oppression, unquote. And this guy obviously knew how to keep the powerful happy, because as our chronicler points out, he had made friends of the nobles, of the soldiers, of the leading men of the state. This, to my mind, is a patronage network very vividly described. You give everybody a stake in your own survival.
Clearly, these guys are very, very politically savvy. And it's also quite striking to me how well aware they seem to be of broader trends in the politics of the Islamic world. Now, I briefly mentioned the Fatimids, for example, who this upstart dynasty claiming descent from the Prophet Muhammad, no doubt just as Sabuktigin was claiming descent from the old emperors of Persia. And now the Fatimids are slowly rising to prominence in the area of modern Libya and so on and so forth, when they get a sudden embassy of all places from Multan. Now, in Multan, it seems, there had been a little community of Shia Muslims that had been set up by emissaries who had come from Yemen a couple of centuries ago. And over the centuries, this little Shia community had become increasingly powerful in the politics of Multan. Although, keep in mind, at this point, Multan is still very much a Hindu city. Now, one particular bunch of fanatics in that city sent a letter to the Fatimid, the leader of the Fatimids, the guy who claims to be a caliph, a guy called Al-Muiz, and says that, hey, the leader of the Shia congregation here is being too nice to these infidels, and he's letting them continue their worship, and he's letting this great idol in the center of the city stand tall and be worshipped every day without even saying a peep about it. So Al-Muiz, obviously, he's quite chuffed that, oh, look, some foreigners have turned to me for endorsement. So what did he say? You go, boys, go for it. So, of course, these fanatics use that excuse to go and essentially smash that idol to pieces, send its head supposedly to Al-Muiz. And Al-Muiz sees this as essentially a symbol of his rising fortunes, and goes on to attack and conquer Egypt, and then set up the city of Al-Qahira, the victorious, now known as Cairo. But of course, the Fatimids are not as fanatical as you would think from that one particular instance. The Fatimids are actually quite interested in trading with the Deccan and so on and so forth. And a lot of ways are also connected to the emergence of global economy, especially because of their demand for Chinese products. But there's really no time for that. What is surprising is that now in 991 AD, a caliph is deposed, and the new caliph now realizes that, okay, I don't want to be deposed. I don't want to be murdered by some Turks or by some of the other warlord or some of the other emir. I have to play my cards better than this. So he realizes that Now, the Fatimid rival of his, who was also claiming to be a caliph and a Shia caliph, no less, has actually given him the keys to his future influence. Because now he can reach out to other Muslims and say, hey, do you guys want to get a certificate of legitimacy? If so, all you have to do is go kill some infidels and I will give you one. And of course, Sabuktigin is far too clever to let an opportunity like that pass.
Right, and where do you start if you're Sabuktigin? Your first most obvious enemy are the Shahis. Now, who are these Shahis?
Shahis sound like some Persians.
Yes, and not for no reason. They're obviously using the old Persian title, really the old Kushana title for kings, even though they're a Hindu dynasty. And they dominate what is really all of Punjab, both what is today Pakistani and Indian Punjab, as well as Khyber Pakhtunkhwa in Pakistan.
So I'm assuming that when Sabuktigin has decided that yes, I can make myself some name and fame by going and attacking these guys, it's not going to be a simple matter, right? Because if it was really that easy for bourgeois upstarts from Persia to take over Indian polities, they would have done it by now. But some things have kind of fallen into place. We talked earlier about the fact that you have these new movements of Turks, that now you have this political sanction, and now you have this entire class of very militarily capable ghulams, of which Sabuktigin himself is one. So a lot of things seem to be coming together. So if you're Sabuktigin, Aditya, how would he have gone about thinking about attacking the Shahis? How would he have... And keep in mind, you can't just throw men at the problem, right? You have to outwit them. You have to out-strategize them. How do you beat them?
Well, you basically play a game that they don't want to play. How do you plan? Firstly, how do you plan campaigning in the plains of India? You have to decide when you're going to do this. Basically, you want to leave before the winter sets in, because if you try and cross the passes into the plains in the winter, they're all going to be snowed up.
Of course.
So you want to cross the passes in late autumn, and you want to hit the plains in the winter. Because, the plains of northern India are at this time fairly pleasant. You can ride long distances during the day on your horses. And you want to basically be done with campaigning by, say, about February. So you might start in October, and you definitely want to be done by February. Because by the time you get back, it's going to get really hot in the plains. The other thing, of course, you're totally avoiding through all this is the monsoon. If you went into the plains right after the monsoons, the rivers would be swollen. There'd be very few places where you could cross. You'd have to commandeer boats, which is always a very dangerous and unpredictable thing. And of course, you don't want to be stuck in the mud while campaigning. The other more interesting problem is, how do you get people to do this job? Why would people want to do this job? Well, there's two broad kinds of motivation. There's spiritual and material. The spiritual motivation comes from being a Ghazi. There's no getting around that. These people were religiously motivated. They believed that by fighting infidels, they were securing themselves a place in heaven. And even if they died while fighting these infidels, they would go to paradise. The other is, of course, material. In fact, there are some contemporary accounts that sort of disparagingly say that the Turks really don't care about religion. What they're really interested in is the plunder. And I can see why they say that. It might be reductionist, but these guys really love the plunder. And in fact, the raids into India set up a sort of self-reinforcing cycle for the Ghaznavids. You need money to pay your armies, and you need to motivate them with the promise of loot. And so you go into India, you do plunder, and you come back, and you can pay your army, you can recruit more people. And when you recruit more people, it means you need to go back and raid again. So it sets up this cycle.
The way that you described is basically they're interested in India primarily as a way to fund military expeditions elsewhere, right? I've come across references, for example, I mentioned the Buyuds earlier. It seems to me that the Ghaznavids were setting themselves up as defenders of a so-called Sunni orthodoxy that supported the Abbasid Caliph in opposition to the Shiite Buyuds. But clearly, in practice, what mattered to them was the advancement of their own power. We don't really know of a lot of instances where the Ghaznavids actually took orders from the Caliph. That was basically a convenient fiction that they manufactured in order to be able to meet their own geopolitical imperatives.
Absolutely, Anirudh. And the first geopolitical imperative, certainly the main one that Sabuktigin had, was to tackle these Shahis who were right next door. This wasn't as simple as he would have liked. In fact, this was a struggle that was going to last about 4 whole decades.
40 years? That's not a narrative that generally comes across in medieval history textbooks, is it?
Exactly. But just think about it. These Shahis are in their home turf. They know exactly what the ground is like. They know what type of forces work here. Yes, the Turks have their amazing horse archers, but not all of the ground in Afghanistan, especially the mountainous tracts, are very suited to horse archers. These are places where light infantry, for example, can work very well.
Interestingly enough, I found out that I'm sure that our listeners would have heard of the Khiljis, a dynasty that later comes to prominence in medieval India. And these Khiljis might be related to a tribal group in Afghanistan called the Khalaj, who at that time served as garrisons of important hill towns that were controlled by the Hindu Shahi kings. We'll have more about the Khalajis very soon in this episode.
Yeah, so clearly this was a very difficult fight for them. And you can get a sense of it from their very first fight. The Shahis had been losing ground in Afghanistan to the Turks over the last century. But the Shahi king, Jaipal, decided to take a stand. And he moved an army right across this whole rugged landscape and set up a fortified position at a place called Lugman. And there's an old text called the Kitab-e-Yamini that tells us what happens next. Quote, "Each army mutually attacked each other, and they fought and resisted in every way until the face of the earth was stained red with the blood of the slain, and the lions and warriors of both armies were worn out and reduced to despair." End quote.
Seems to have been a match between two almost equal forces, and some pretty intense skirmishing seems to have happened on that day.
Yeah, this is obviously a poet's very polite way of saying it was a stalemate. But then, of course, there's some sort of divine intervention.
Of course.
Sabuktigin himself talks about how he essentially cast a sort of spell on these guys. Now, obviously, this sounds ridiculous to our ears, but what seems to have happened was a terrible storm broke out. In fact, one of the accounts talks about, quote, "A great flash of lightning shone forth and the furious winds arose and a bitter cold succeeded so that no one could at all endure to remain there." End quote. Another account tells of great hailstones raining down on the Shahis. Now, of course, when people talk about the supernatural and curses and gods looking unfavorably on the Shahis, we laugh. But the storm actually is not implausible. Even back in the 7th century, you have the Chinese monk traveler Shunzhang talking about how hailstorms and snowstorms in Ghazni, for example, are very common. And in fact, in 2013, there was a 30-minute long hailstorm near Kandahar, which killed 3 people. And left dozens of NATO aircraft inoperable. And accounts then talked about hailstones the size of golf balls or bigger. Now, if you imagine a storm like that, a hailstorm followed by a snowstorm, you can imagine that the Shahis decide, let's just fight another day and retreat. And that's what seems to have happened. Now, of course, that other day of fighting comes very soon. Again, both sides are ready to clash. This time, an account from much later from Firishta tells us that Jaipal had actually managed to form a coalition of sorts of so-called Hindu rulers from all parts of India.
Of course, a national coalition.
National coalition to fight Sabuktigin. Now, it's possible that Jaipal got some help from someone. Somebody sent the odd force. Maybe some people raised money. But remember, this is a fight very far away between 2 provincial kingdoms. So let's not take this very seriously.
None of the great kings of like the middle India would have really given a crap about it, beyond the fact that, okay, maybe there's a chance of making these chaps our vassals. So let's send some kind of token force perhaps, and of course it was in the interest of later Muslim historians to kind of spin this as some kind of great attempt by all the manliest Hindu kings who were still not able to hold up to the forces of God as commanded by the great and valiant Sabuktigin.
Exactly. It's a great way to make the Turks look superhuman, right? But this time, actually, the Turks come into their own. And they fight in the way that we are accustomed to hearing of Turks fighting. So now the 2 armies, Jaipal's and Sabuktigin's, are facing off against each other. But Sabuktigin decides to do something very different. He divides his cavalry into packs of 500. And he likens them to wolves. And he has these packs of 500 go around circling and swooping around the enemy, attacking them, feigning retreat. This is a very familiar Turkic tactic. This is where you charge at an enemy, forcing him to close ranks, and then you shower arrows on him, and then you retreat. Now, if the enemy decides to pursue you, he's actually made his problem worse because he's going to be spread out. He's going to open himself to attack from more of these wolf packs, if you will. And he's just going to be showered by arrows. His cavalry is going to be smashed into by men with lances and so on.
I'm just thinking realistically, What kind of operational skills would you have had to have to make this work in practice, right? You need to have groups of 500 soldiers who are so disciplined, they're able to ride in cohesive formations, to fire volleys, to be able to know when the right time is to retreat, and they need to be able to coordinate within the larger command structure. Whether or not they're getting orders from subcontinent directly, they have to be able to observe the actions of other such squadrons, observe how the enemy is reacting to other squadrons, look at windows of opportunity, charge in. There's an extraordinary level of training that's required, not just for your average ghulam with his bow and his horse, but also the officers who are commanding them, the lance-wielding cavalry they're working in conjunction with.
Exactly. And all of this is happening in the heat and dust of battle. People are dying, people are being injured, there are clouds of dust everywhere, you don't necessarily know where people are. And there's two types of skills here. One is the actual fighting skill, which I'll just come to in a second. The other is, like you said, it's command. It's about coordinating. It's about knowing when to attack. It's about knowing where other friendly forces are. It's about gauging whether it's the right moment to attack. And remember, you will not have perfect information. The enemy will be clouded by dust. You might not be able to see all of them. And you still have to make those judgments, and you need to make them very effectively. But I think the other thing that the Turks are doing over here is really harnessing something that is very integral to their own way of life. I mentioned before how for the Turks, hunting and fighting were really very similar activities. And a lot of this is really like hunting. I mean, that's why Sabuktigin likens these bodies of 500 horsemen to wolves. They are, in a sense, herding the enemy. And by herding the enemy, you're doing a few things. One thing is you're forcing the enemy to react to you. So the enemy is always doing something in reaction to what you're doing and is not able to take steps of their own. Because the moment the enemy tries to take initiative again, you have another wolf pack charging at them. And again, the enemy has to keep adjusting. The other thing is this whole business of charging, of shaping the way the enemy moves is very much like herding and hunting.
Yeah.
The two activities that Turks know very intimately. We always talk about how social and economic structure are very integrally linked to military performance, even in our time. And this is, I think, a very perfect example of how the Turks were able to use discipline and command and marry that with something that is very integrally tied to their way of life and basically be very militarily effective.
I'm just thinking of what the average Shahi soldier might have been thinking on that day when he's facing off against these wolf packs, right? Imagine as an Indian soldier used to fighting in these big heavy vyuhas, which we talked about in great detail in our last episode. You're used to fighting battles in a certain kind of way. To have the initiative just completely stripped from you like this, to be herded almost like an animal, to be in this big mass of disoriented soldiers like yourself who have no idea what is happening, who are terrified by these ponies that are drawing really close to you, whooping and then drawing back away and knowing that sooner or later you're going to die. It must have been quite a terrifying moment for a lot of them. And clearly it worked in Sabuktigin's favor.
I agree with you. I think you just alluded to the psychological impact that this would have. There are accounts from elsewhere of Turks howling like wolves, or perhaps ululating, like that. I do terribly, but you get the idea. And, all of this definitely has a certain psychological impact. It's like beating drums in an old-fashioned infantry battle. It's menacing. The other thing is, of course, just that archery. We talked earlier about Al-Jahiz, the chronicler who wrote about the Turks. Here's what he has to say about their skills at archery. Quote, "If 1,000 of their horse join battle and let off a single shower of arrows, they can mow down 1,000 horse. No army can withstand this kind of assault. The Kharijites and the Bedouin have no skill worth mentioning in shooting from horseback, but the Turk can shoot at beasts, birds, hoops, men, sitting quarry, dummies and birds on the wing, and they can do so at full gallop to the fore or to the rear, to left or right, upwards or downwards, losing tens of arrows before a Kharijite can knock even one. And if they do turn their back, they are to be feared as much as deadly poison and sudden death, for their arrows hit the mark as much as when they are retreating as when they are advancing." End quote.
So they can actually turn around when the horse is running away and shoot back at enemies that are pursuing them. The famous Parthian shot, which is actually, I think, the etymological ancestor of our parting shot today.
Yeah, we're not clear if they're actually ancestors, but yes, the parting shot, the famous Scythian parting shot, is also something that Turks, just like other steppe nomads, are really good at. They can actually swing around on their horse, looking backwards, and lose a shot at you and really hit something.
You'll see a depiction of that in the episode artwork for,
exactly.
for this episode.
Yeah, and just imagine if, say, you are holding a shield. The shield doesn't necessarily protect you if an arrow goes through it. In fact, there are accounts throughout military history of the arrows of a horse archer basically impaling your arm to your own shield.
Yeah.
The other thing is that horses are by themselves huge targets. So when the Shahis come out with their great cavalry, they're actually presenting massive targets to Sabuktigin.
Interestingly enough, if you look at Shahi coins, you can actually see, and I honestly recommend that all of our listeners actually look up some of these medieval Indian coins because they're absolutely beautiful. A lot of us are used to thinking of coins in the way that the modern Republic of India makes them, which are obviously based on these totally outdated British and then even further back Roman and Greek models, which focus on a very realistic depiction of a lot of things. But medieval Indians seem to have understood graphic design, man. They're just these beautiful coins with like very stark typefaces and very abstract depictions of kings and so on and so forth, just highly stylized. And the way that Shahi coins are depict the Shahi kings is usually as heavy cavalrymen wielding lances. So I can see how potentially, goes without saying that Sabuktigin understood that this is how the Shahis fought, and he seems to have gone out of his way to kind of develop a force that was tailored to counter that.
Absolutely. Shahis are very much part of this larger system of cultures in sedentary societies throughout, in which you have basically a horse-born military aristocracy. And they fight in fairly similar ways. They ride on horse, they fight with lances, they fight with swords, they use shields, they wear armor. But one thing about these guys is that the Shahis are at some disadvantages. It's not just the horse archers. It's also that the Ghaznavids have more access to other technologies. The iron horseshoe, for example, better stirrups and saddles. They also just have access to better horses. It's really hard if you're in India to get horses because India is not really horse country. Okay, but this battle that we just talked about is really not the end by any stretch of imagination of the fight between the Ghaznavids and the Shahis. And Sabuktigin never lives to see it. He dies in 997. And his son Mahmud takes over after killing his own brother, of course.
Of course. Sounds like a really pleasant sort of chap, huh? And I believe that there's this... There's one really famous quote that is often attributed to Mahmud. I don't know how verifiable this really is, but it goes something on the lines of, King's face should gladden the minds of those who set eyes upon him, whereas mine seems to bring only misfortune to all who see it. So Mahmud's clearly got some major issues. He doesn't seem to really have the best body image. In a lot of ways, he's Sabuktigin's son. He's clearly a very, very capable military commander, but he doesn't do a lot of very good things with that talent, let's just say.
Yeah, he's obviously a very talented military commander, but I think from what little we understand of his campaigns and his later infamous raids into India, we'll see that he has some things to learn. But he really starts off his career as ruler by again going after those Shahis, of course. And this time, once again, he's really successful. From the account that we have of the battle, it would seem that the Ghaznavids targeted the Shahi elephants this time, and they did so by loosing arrows at the legs of these elephants, which would seem to indicate that these elephants were actually fairly well armored, and so they were looking for weak spots. And then you have accounts of...
I was thinking this is something that only the Turks, this is a weakness that only the Turks would have been able to exploit. Only they would have had the ability to move up that close, lose arrows at such a small moving target, and then get out of range before they could be killed.
Yeah, and it's possible some of them dismounted and did this. These guys are very flexible. They know how to improvise. Then, of course, you have accounts of soldiers going ahead and using their swords to cut off the trunks of these elephants and bring them down. I'm sure what these accounts don't tell you is, they don't tell you about the soldier who was picked up by an elephant and smashed on the ground and turned into a pile of gore by its foot.
Had his head squelched in by the elephant's foot.
And so after this, elephant cavalry is dealt with, the slaughter starts, of course. And you have, again, a very graphic, poetic account, quote, "And swords flash like lightning amid the blackness of the clouds, and fountains of blood flowed like the fall of setting stars. The friends of God had defeated their obstinate opponents and quickly put them to a complete rout. Noon had not arrived when the Mussulmans had wreaked their vengeance on the infidel enemies of God, killing 15,000 of them and spreading them like a carpet over the ground, making them food for beasts and birds of prey."
I am just amazed at the quality of the propagandists that the Ghaznavids seem to have hired to spin all this for them.
Absolutely.
It's also interesting that you mentioned this, Aditya, because I think very soon after this, Mahmud goes and attacks those good old Shia Ismailis who are chilling out in Multan, who I mentioned earlier in this episode. And he does something quite similar to them as well. So he's kind of an equal opportunity offender. And of course, when the Fatimid Caliph hears about this, of course, now at this point, the Fatimids are a lot more important. So they send an ambassador to Mahmud and say, hey, what's going on, buddy? Maybe you should consider kind of toning yourself down. And Mahmud, of course, kills the ambassador, which is received with great joy in the Abbasid court. And the Abbasid Caliph, who is supposedly so delighted with Mahmud's activities against the infidel Shias and the infidel Hindus, actually sends him robes of honor to proclaim him to have really arrived, as it were. So you can really see how Mahmud's military activities cannot be separated from the broader socio-political context within which the guy is operating. As violent as it is to our modern ears, this was the norm for the medieval period. I can describe Indian inscriptions which actually talk about violence committed against elephants in similarly graphic terms. For example, the Chola Emperor Kulotunga Chola. This is roughly around the same time, actually. These guys are rough contemporaries. Think about that. There's this book called the Kalinga Parani. I'm sure I'm absolutely mangling the pronunciation, but it describes the aftermath of a battle that's fought between the Cholas and the Chodagangas of the Kalinga area, which is Orissa, and talks of heaps and heaps of elephants, tens of thousands just strewn across the battlefield. And essentially, the goddess Kali is visited by a number of her demons and ghouls who talk about how they've feasted on the flesh and marrow of all the bodies that Kulotunga Chola has strewn across the battlefield. And how different are these people really? Their power speaks to a logic of its own. Power does not care about the lives of those who die in order to serve it.
And clearly, Mahmud also didn't really care about any of the little people. He's supposed to be a soldier of God, a Ghazi, which means he's at the very least supposed to give people the chance to convert to Islam, but mostly he just goes around slaughtering them. The other thing is, of course, his famed or notorious 17-odd raids into India are also very much plundering expeditions. He's using India to make money, basically.
So in the last episode, we talked extensively about this great imperial city of Kannauj, which at its peak in the 9th century, all the three great empires of India were basically fighting over control of it. And it's quite interesting that Mahmud also at some point during his raids decides to go for Kannauj. And when he does that, keep in mind that we talked in the last episode how when an army moves, it spreads basically a wave of fear and refugees before it. It seems that something similar was happening, at least with Mahmud's early raids, until other Indian kings began to realize that this posed a serious material threat to them and began to invest in actually building up the systems required to fight the Turks. When Mahmud, for example, attacked Thanesar, according to Muslim accounts, he entered the city unopposed and basically looted and sacked it to his heart's content. And when he went to Kannauj soon afterwards, the amount of panic that was created in the city was so utterly absolute that there seems to have been a state of mass hysteria. People just fled, dropped everything, went wherever they could find refuge. And the king himself, along with the city's Brahmins and a number of senior military officers, is supposed to have taken refuge in Bari, which is about 4 days to the east of there. So somewhere on the route to Bari was a place called Manj, the so-called Citadel of the Brahmins, according to Muslim sources. And when they realized that there was no way out for them, many of these Brahmins, as well as the fighting men, are supposed to have thrown themselves from the walls, burned themselves, burned their wives, burned their children, burned their houses, or just rushed out against the invader and were obviously just effortlessly picked off by the Turks. So there's no two ways about this. It's a highly traumatic, highly, highly shocking and extremely violent experience. But what does the king of Kannauj do after all this? He talks. He comes down to Mahmud, and Mahmud also is, again, he's not a fanatic. He realizes that, look, boss, I need to be coming back into India again and again. I cannot have every single Hindu king fighting against me all the time, because he has his own limitations, he has his own imperatives, as I pointed out. He's got the Buyids to fight away. He's got the rising power of Khwarezm to his north to fight away. So he also understands, he's not a fanatic. He knows that he can make deals with these people. Because in a lot of ways, this culture of the military aristocracy transcends linguistic boundaries. It transcends religious boundaries. So he actually makes this king of Kannauj his vassal. And of course, when the more powerful kings of India hear about this, they're not necessarily too happy for multiple reasons. First of all, that the king of Kannauj has dared to set himself up as a vassal to this barbarian who has come from across the mountains. Second of all, that he, though he is their neighbor, is now the vassal of somebody who doesn't even spend most of his year in India. So we hear of this king called Vidyadhara, who is the king of the Chandelas, who are most famous, of course, for the temples of Khajuraho. And Vidyadhara actually goes and attacks Kannauj and kills Mahmud's vassal. Now, of course, the way that nationalist historians have portrayed this is that, oh, he was avenging the honor of India. To which I say, just face palm, buddy, just learn a little bit before making up bullshit like this. Now, what does Mahmud do when he finds out that his vassal has been killed? Does he go, oh yeah, it's just these Hindus killing Hindus, I don't really care? No, he realizes that his authority as an Indian king is being challenged. So he actually brings his forces down there to fight with Vidyadhara. And Vidyadhara, as brave as he was killing off this minor vassal of Mahmud's, does not seem to have the ability to actually fight Mahmud off in a pitched battle. So supposedly these guys face off against each other on a riverbank. There seems to be a stalemate, basically. There's some skirmishing that doesn't lead to anything one day or another. And the way that Muslim sources describe it is that the infidel got scared and ran away. I don't really think that was the case. I think that Vidyadhara understood that I can't stay here forever, but neither can Mahmud. So he just packed up his camp and left. And the next time that Vidyadhara and Mahmud managed to butt heads, this time it was a little more complex in the sense that Vidyadhara's position was way stronger. He was actually defending a fort called Kalanjara, which was supposed to have been extraordinarily well defended, all right? So it's supposed to have had a garrison of 500,000 men, 200,000 head of cattle, and 500 elephants within its walls. So obviously, Vidyadhara is prepared for this. He knows that the Turk can't stay for too long, so he's fortified a position to kind of force the guy to come to him. But at the same time, Mahmud, while he realizes that he can't stay there forever, he realizes that he can't just leave Vidyadhara to challenge him for the rest of his reign. He can't just leave Vidyadhara there and raid through the rest of India with impunity. So what do? Does the great defender of the Indian nation refuse to talk to this evil fanatic who wants to kill all Hindus? Not at all. They talk. And most interestingly, the ruler pays Chandela king Vidyadhara surrenders elephants to Mahmud, which is something that Indian kings do to each other. Yeah. More interestingly, he's said to have written verses for Mahmud. Now, Vidyadhara literally means bearer of knowledge. This guy clearly is highly sophisticated, highly educated, but he writes verses for Mahmud, once again seeing him as an equal. And then supposedly Mahmud had a lot of Indian, Arab and Persian scholars who were hanging out with him in his camp, who all said that yes, these are good quality verses. So now Mahmud knows that yes, the king isn't trying to screw me over. He issues a farman saying that yes, Vidyadhara is in charge of this kingdom. And what does he do? Mahmud, who got robes of honor from the Abbasid Caliph, gives robes of honor to Vidyadhara of the Chandelas.
I'm sure he didn't want to tell the caliphs about that.
Definitely not.
This actually gets me onto another subject, which is how much ability did Mahmud's excursions have to carry out prolonged sieges? I don't think they did. And the reason for this, I think, is that they relied a lot on mobility. Hear about people talking about, well, who defeated Mahmud on so-and-so raid of his? Well, not necessarily anyone, because Mahmud was not necessarily always looking for a fight. His army, to a great extent, was men on horseback. Their baggage train, a lot of their baggage train is camels. So they're very mobile. And if there's an army in their way, they don't want to fight. They can just go around it. And I think that's what they did really a lot of the time.
That's a crucial point, because even though nationalists have, of course, tried to make it out like Mahmud had gone out and like essentially depopulated the whole of North India in 2 years, we don't see anywhere near that kind of demographic shift in contemporary sources. It seems that when there were casualties, it was primarily among the fighting men, and there weren't very often those many head-on clashes, as you pointed out, for multiple reasons. A, because Mahmud's too mobile. He doesn't need to stay and fight. He's more interested in hitting the weak targets forts and getting out with whatever he can. And also because I think Indian kings recognize this. They know that if they can fortify their cities like Vidyadhara did and keep their most important assets intact, then Mahmud's free to basically pillage and loot and kill the peasants. It's not really the king's problem.
Yeah. And of course, it's a problem for the people who get in the way of Mahmud's sword. And a lot of people did.
Yeah.
So while we're on the subject of Mahmud killing innocent people, let's talk about his most notorious raid, the one on Somnath temple in 1025-26. This is a pretty fascinating raid, partly simply because of the logistics involved. We know that Mahmud's army used Multan as a staging post. They replenished themselves with water, loaded up on perhaps thousands of camels that were being used as pack animals. And this large army of maybe 30,000 men on horseback, on camels, and on elephants made its way south. They actually took a route via Jaisalmer towards Gujarat, where the Somnath temple is located. And along the way, they attacked a fort near Jaisalmer in order to basically restock again on supplies. So this was logistically a very challenging campaign. Now, by the time they got to Somnath, Somnath temple is built right next to the beach. It's a very spectacular location. The temple was also walled. And what's really strange is that it seemed to have been thronging with devotees, with pilgrims. This was a very popular temple back in the day, and a lot of people from all over India used to come there.
Or maybe Mahmud planned his raid to actually reach there on the day of a major pilgrimage
Entirely
event or
possible,
something.
yes. And what's really strange is that the people inside, at least according to the accounts that we have, the people inside were very cocky, and they were actually taunting Mahmud's men. So Mahmud's men, the very next day, unleashed a shower of arrows into the compound. After that, they placed ladders on the walls and tried to scale the compound, and they were repulsed a few times. And by the time they got in, of course, the slaughter started. We have accounts, of course, of people weeping, going to the idol at Somnath and asking for a blessing before going out and fighting Mahmud's men. There's also a story from much later about two princes, local princes, coming to act as a sort of relieving force and then being driven off as well by Mahmud's forces. It's also likely that some devotees in the area tried to escape by boats and were cut down on the beaches or were pursued and drowned in the sea. All in all, lots of people were killed. The accounts say 50,000, which is almost certainly a ridiculous exaggeration. Mahmud is supposed to have then taken the idol. One story goes that he smashed the idol with his own sword and that precious jewels fell out of it, which is quite unlikely.
Yeah, I mean, the iconographic texts on Indian idols never ever mention that they should be made hollow and filled with jewels.
Exactly, yeah.
So you should automatically question how reliable a lot of the stuff that Mahmud's propagandists are saying about this raid, but it would certainly seem that it was an event of spectacular and horrifying brutality.
Exactly, yeah. And so Mahmud and his army collected this shivling, whether intact or in fragments, and decided to return to Ghazni. Now again, they had to go through the desert, and the story goes that they were looking for a guide, and one person volunteered.
How convenient.
And after a day and night in the desert, they suddenly found that they were in a spot without any water. So this guide was summoned, and he very bluntly said, "I have devoted my life for the idol of Somnath, and I have led you and your army into this desert, in any part of which water is not to be found, in order that you may all perish." Unquote. Now you can imagine what Mahmud's reaction must have been. So obviously he orders this man to be executed. And he really must have been thinking, is this how it all ends? Just being led here by this one person whose name is now, of course, lost to history. And the story is that he went and prayed in the desert and was shown a light and led his army once again.
How convenient.
Yes, to water. But what seems to have happened is that they eventually, by luck and perhaps fieldcraft, found some water again and survived, though certainly some men in his army perished as a result of this guide. So now once they were out of the desert and reached Sindh, there was another obstacle. As they were going up the Indus River, Mahmud's men were harassed by local Jat tribes, who after attacking them would clamber onto boats and take refuge in the river. So this was all in all a very tough return journey for Mahmud and his forces. And of course, by the time they got back to Ghazni, the fragments of the idol were supposedly placed on the steps of the royal palace and the Jami Masjid so that the faithful could step on those fragments and defile them every day, and so on, all that nonsense. But the following year, Mahmud decides he has to take revenge on these Jats. But this is going to be a very different campaign from the one in Somnath, because he realizes that these guys can actually go and take refuge in the river. So he actually constructs a fleet of boats. And these boats also seem to have been improvised in some ways. Apparently, these boats were reinforced by long iron bars, which had spokes on them that basically acted as rams. And each of these boats carried several archers, some men with naft, or basically some carrying incendiaries that could be thrown. And they launched this army against the Bhatti Jats of the Sindh, and there was apparently a slaughter. The Jats' boats were destroyed, they were burnt or rammed, and those that had taken refuge in these sandy islands in the middle of the river, which would have included the women and children, were also either slaughtered or enslaved.
So much of this, seems so convenient to this narrative. It would seem that this raid that Mahmud committed on Somnath was not really as uncontested as his propagandists would like us to believe. I, for one, have come across some sources indicating that much more powerful Indian kings somehow found out that the Turks were doing this, and Mahmud knew that forces were on the way. That might have been one of the reasons why he was willing to just put his entire army's fate in the hands of a local guide like that. And it also seems convenient that this man, who had absolutely no experience actually fighting riverine combat operations, somehow managed to magically defeat an entire tribe who had dedicated their lives to doing that just because they inconvenienced him once. A lot of it seems far too convenient to be realistic. And of course, there's the simple fact that, not as far as I know, no Indian sources actually mention Mahmud's so-called raid on Somnath. Basically, don't take Mahmud's word for anything. Least of all, the fact that God sent him a light to lead him out of the desert and bring him back home.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a few things over here. When Mahmud talks about how he prays to God and God gets him out of trouble, this is obviously propaganda, right? And you wonder how religious the man himself really was, or did he think he had a private understanding of his own with God, where he could say, hey, I have to say this. So just let me go. Don't send me to hell. I don't want to spend eternity with that guide. The other thing is, while you're absolutely right, one reason that Mahmud probably left Somnath within a fortnight is because he got intelligence that a larger army was headed his way. And that probably reflects in what seems to be the lack of planning in the return. You also talked about how you think it's unlikely that they attacked these riverine people. I agree, and I don't think that fight was as uncontested as he makes it out to be. Also, the very fact that he bothered to do this revenge expedition shows that the Jats really got under his skin.
Absolutely.
But I will say to his credit that I think Mahmud and his army were actually pretty competent. They thought about logistics quite systematically. They were also adaptive to different circumstances. And whatever the actual course of events during that riverine battle, I think that it does reflect something about their adaptability, as well as their access to the military innovations that were coursing their way through Central Asia, such as naft, the incendiaries. So I think there we do have to give Mahmud and his army some credit. Another thing I think we have to give him credit for is the fact that while he's frequently described as this Ghazi, Mahmud frequently hired Indians, frequently hired Hindus, and these people served in his army.
I think one absolutely fascinating example I've come across is a chap called Tilak, who was the son of a barber and seems to have spent the earlier part of his life in Kashmir. Now, we don't know too many details about his life, but given that we've talked about how Indians became part of the military aristocracy through service in the last episode, that Tilak might have been doing something similar in Kashmir. He might have essentially, it's quite surprising to see the son of a barber essentially serving in a military capacity and his name actually surviving down to the present day. It would seem to me that this guy was not just militarily capable, but also went out of his way to educate himself, went out of his way to be noticed by court power structures. So, for example, he's described as being skilled and experienced with command over language and a fine hand in both Hindi and Persian writing, which is, again, it's indicative of a remarkable degree of adaptability. And Tilak is certainly not the only Hindu officer who is known to have served in Mahmud's army. We have to keep in mind that a lot of people who are living in the subcontinent, choosing to fight for Mahmud or choosing to fight for a so-called native king isn't necessarily a binary choice. You serve the army that is willing to pay you more. You serve the army that seems to be victorious. You serve the army that serves your interests best. And you have a very, very wide variety of social groups, keep in mind, many of whom are not very well off under Indian political regimes and who might see some benefits to working with Mahmud. Of course, some historians have gone to the other extreme and tried to portray Mahmud as some kind of liberator who was here to destroy the caste system, which is absolute nonsense. Al-Biruni, for example, the great Muslim polymath who was known to have accompanied Mahmud on some of these raids, who's known to have interacted with Indian intellectuals, Brahmins, and tried to get a better understanding of India, actually talks about caste in fairly glowing terms. He seems to think it's a pretty nice way of organizing societies. And you see in a lot of cases that Muslims don't necessarily see the caste system as a bad thing. We have other writers who are actually working in Mahmud's court who have left us with a description of the caste system as they understand it. I quote, "The people of India are different from other people in that while all peoples get mixed up together, the Hindus do not. From the time of Adam, their custom is that men of different occupations do not intermarry. Thus, greengrocers marry with greengrocers' daughters, butchers with butchers, bakers with bakers, a soldier with a soldier's, a Brahmin with a Brahmin's. Thus, every category of people among them has a different nature. I cannot enumerate all, since this will divert this book from its main purpose, but the best of them are benevolent as well as wise and brave. One of such is either a Brahmin or a Raut. A Raut is basically what these guys call Rajputs, or a Kirar, merchant. The Brahmin is wise, the Raut brave, the Kirar a head of householders. The Brahmin is usually a scholar, the Raut a good soldier." Now, keep in mind that these guys are essentially foreigners who are looking at this very, very old social system with the eyes of somebody who recognizes that this is an equally ancient culture that deserves respect. They don't fully understand its context, of course. They don't fully understand how caste really operates. And there are a lot of questions to ask about whether the caste system was really as rigid as Muslim authors thought it was. Just as the British, when they came in, didn't really understand how flexible caste can actually be in practice.
Exactly.
But the fact remains that clearly these guys did look at caste and did realize that this is how Indians organize themselves. But at the same time, you have Mahmud taking the son of a barber who seems to have risen up within an Indian context to be a military officer, and then makes him one of his military officers. And quite surprisingly, Tilak rises so far up in Mahmud's hierarchy that he's known to have sat alongside the Turkish emirs in their war planning councils, and he's known to have borne the title of Amir al-Umarai al-Hind, so the foremost of the emirs who are in charge of commanding the armies of Hindustan, which is again very fascinating.
What's really fascinating is that once you get away from the usual propaganda and read someone like Al-Biruni, you get a sense of how much regard they had for this culture that they were encountering. One example actually is the Shahis. We talked about how the fight with the Shahis lasted for 4 decades. By the time Mahmud's armies finally finished off the Shahis, they almost look back at them elegiacally. There's a wonderful quote from Al-Biruni again that goes, "The dynasty of the Hindu Shahis is now extinct, and of the whole house there is no longer the slightest remnant in existence. We must say that in all their grandeur they never slackened in the ardent desire to do that which is good and right, and that they were men of noble sentiment and bearing." End quote. Now, this is Victorian English because it comes from an old 19th century translation, but you get the sense that these guys had the greatest respect for their foremost enemies.
More than that, I also get the sense that we talked about the caste system earlier, and they mentioned how the Brahmin is supposed to be so noble and the Rajput is supposed to be so noble and brave and so on and so forth. And very often this has been interpreted as basically being a eulogy to these castes and how they behave in modern society, which I don't think is the way we should see them. Rather, I would say that this clearly reflects the fact that these Muslim Turkish scholars are trying to grapple with the concept of dharma and how various castes and social groups are supposed to behave according to a certain kind of dharma. We talked in great detail in the last episode about how military men are supposed to behave. the so-called dharma of warriors, which is something that they practice only towards each other, keep in mind, not necessarily towards people who are lower than them in the social hierarchy. But it's still so interesting to me that the Muslims are trying to understand this. And I think it's a very clear indication that interaction between these two cultures is not necessarily as binary or as confrontational as nationalists on both sides have tried to portray it. But that said, let's not try to romanticize them. Mahmud took slaves from India. Sometimes the numbers that are given are absolutely astronomical. And even if these are scaled up for the purposes of propaganda, they're fairly horrifying. So I quote a few primary sources that are quoted in Andre Wing's excellent book, Al-Hind, which I highly recommend to all of our listeners. So here's one. Mahmud took away about 500,000 slaves of the children and girls of that area. Here's another one. A lot of booty in treasure and slaves and animals were taken away. Here's another one. The Sultan returned with so many slaves that they became very cheap, and men who were respectable in their own country were degraded by becoming slaves of common shopkeepers. Here's another one. The army of Islam brought to Ghazna about 200,000 captives and much wealth, so that the capital appeared like an Indian city, no soldier of the camp being without wealth or without many slaves. Let's not cut corners about the kind of social trauma that this must have had, even if you scale this down by a factor of 10. For people who have lived their entire lives in India as ostensibly law-abiding citizens, or even if they were not law-abiding, even if they were the wealthiest, most powerful people, to be dragged away to another land like this, to be humiliated, to be physically violated, I'm absolutely sure, to be stripped of their families, of their belongings, it's a highly traumatic experience. And though some historians have tried to portray Mahmud as being some kind of civilized Persianate intellectual who was only doing this because it was all about the money, let's not forget, as we mentioned in the beginning of the episode, that these are real human beings we're talking about. These are real human lives we're talking about.
When we talk about these people being taken as slaves, let's be clear that it's very different from the slavery of the Mamelukes, of the Turkic soldiers. These are more like slaves of the sort we are used to hearing about. It may not have been as terrible, perhaps, as the transatlantic slave, but it came pretty close. And we have some sense of that from the late 18th and 19th centuries, when many parts of Central Asia, like Bukhara, were still centers of slave trade. By then, the supply of slaves from India had ended. But these people were still going out hunting Persian and Russian slaves. And from the accounts that we have, the conditions of these people were pretty terrible.
It's not just Mahmud that's doing this, right? I'm sure that Mahmud was merely the tip of the iceberg. Once a precedent like that was established, given the kind of pervasive political anarchy and the fact that so many ambitious, basically criminals, saw a way to political legitimacy, to religious legitimacy through doing this, you have to wonder the kind of violence that must have been unleashed. You would have had packs of these slavers essentially invading India, trying to get their hands on as many beautiful slaves as they could, and sending them away to markets far away in the Middle East. And the heart really breaks to think of the stories of these people and what they must have gone through.
Absolutely. And all of these people's names are lost to history. But I just want to go back to Mahmud and to the many contradictions that he embodies. While he's doing all these horrendous things, he's also trying to portray himself as this very Indian king. Remember, by defeating the Shah, he actually controls a large chunk of Punjab, and he has to rule over Indians there.
And it's not just ruling over Indians. You have to keep in mind that Mahmud is surrounded by many Indian kingdoms. Mahmud realizes that you have to interact with these people the way they expect to be interacted with. Now, we talked earlier about how, for example, Mahmud interacted with Vidyadhara, the Chandela king. We talked about how they exchanged elephants. We talked even about how some elephants might have been used in Mahmud's campaigns in Somnath. And I came across this fascinating paper by a chap called Ali Anushahr. Again, highly recommended, excellent paper, which makes a very interesting argument about what really the Ghaznavids were trying to achieve in India. And though, of course, they have very often been portrayed as essentially these upstarts who are just out there to raid and make a lot of money, the picture that emerges is really a lot more complex than that. First is, of course, the simple fact that Mahmud was issuing coins that are strikingly similar to Shahi coins. Now, we talked earlier about the Shahi coins and the fact that they depict the king as a lancer and so on and so forth. these are exactly the same. So on the one side, you will see these beautiful Sanskrit glyphs on one side of the coin. On the other will be Mahmud, basically as a Shahi king, but with Mahmud of Ghazni written in Arabic script. So clearly he's trying to speak to his Indian subjects as well. And that's not all that he's doing. He's also speaking to other Indian kings in a language of power that they recognize. You talked about how the rest of the Islamic world doesn't necessarily have the highest opinion of Mahmud. Of course, you have the religious nut jobs who are all like, oh yes, absolutely, this is the kind of guy we want. This guy is the ideal Muslim. But of course, you also have people like the Abbasids who are much more uncomfortable with what Mahmud is doing and who essentially see him as a mad barbarian. Mahmud uses elephants in remarkable ways. As we mentioned, this is a guy who's capable of executing some quite surprising military innovations. One of the things that he first latches onto is the fact that elephants are really useful in logistics in an Indian context. We have a lot of examples of elephants being used to carry back treasure from India, for example. We even have examples of Indian princes who are forced to attend upon Mahmud in his camp, who have to walk between rows of elephants as they go up to him, which is quite surprising. It's a clear indication that the Turks are not just interacting with Indians to say, oh, these guys are so exotic and they have caste and they have dharma, but also that this is how the Indians do things. This is how they use elephants. Like, they're actually getting into the symbolic texture of Indian kingship and trying to emulate that. And of course, there's a lot of military use for this as well. We know that, for example, when Mahmud was trying to get into Sistan, which is basically the southern part of modern Afghanistan, kind of overlapping a bit with Iran and Pakistan, there were many powerful Muslim polities there who did not get along with Mahmud at all. We know that Mahmud sent one of his largest bull elephants charging straight against the gate, and the sheer horror that the people of Sistan felt when they saw this enormous creature basically grabbing onto one of their soldiers with its trunk, throwing him up in the air, grabbing him and then basically savaging him, smashing through the gate like it was made of cardboard or something. And keep in mind that to a Muslim, seeing an elephant being used, there are incidents in the Quran where essentially heretics attack the Kaaba using elephants, and God has to intervene using a plague of birds who throw little rocks on the elephants and basically slaughter them that way. These guys are aware of elephants, and it has deeply satanic and demonic connections in the Muslim mythos. And for Mahmud as a king to be using all this is a matter of great horror to the Orthodox Muslim. As if killing other Muslims wasn't bad enough, killing them with elephants is a matter of absolute horror. But Mahmud doesn't really stop. He understands that, yes, these elephants are very useful for me. We know of one instance where it's somewhere in Central Asia. We talked about how Mahmud was fighting north of Ghazna itself, trying to establish authority there. He used elephants there. Imagine an Indian elephant in Central Asia. And
with Indian mahouts.
And not just Indian mahouts, but also the entire accoutrements that we talked about in our first episode, including percussive drums, including the conch shell. Just imagine Indian conch shells being used by Mahmud of Ghazni, of all people, in Central Asia. And it indicates that this guy he's not just looking at elephants as a military technology, but also partly as a social technology. A lot of authors have gone out of their way to kind of portray the Turks as being primarily inspired by Persian culture, which I'm sure is definitely happened to an extent. For example, during Mahmud's reign, we start to see compilations of the Shahnama, which is basically this great list of Iranian kings, and you see them going out of their way to connect Mahmud to them and so on and so forth. But we're also hearing stuff like Mahmud using elephants, Mahmud using drums, Mahmud using conch shells, Mahmud using imperial umbrellas, which are present in Persian traditions, sure, but are also very present in Indian royal traditions. Why do we always assume that the Turks were only taking inspiration from the Persians and never from Indian social systems? It doesn't make any sense. If you're at the crossroads between these two great imperial traditions, between these two great cultural intellectual traditions, first of all, clearly Persianate and Indian political cultures had been talking to each other even before the Turks came, and even after the Turks came, it's quite obvious the Turks were taking elements from both of these guys to try and make something new, something that worked within their political context. It's quite surprising to me, really. If you look at Toramana, who was this Heptalite Han who invades India much, much earlier, so I'm talking about roughly the 5th century, so nearly half a millennium before all this happens. Toramana, who is again this Central Asian guy who starts off as the leader of an army of cavalry archers, when he invades India, starts to use elephants. He starts to call himself Maharaja Adhiraja, and he's issuing coins where he says stuff like the Lord of the Earth, having conquered Earth through his meritorious deeds, wins heaven, which is exactly the kind of thing you see on Indian coins from roughly the same time. And you really got to think about the way that we portray these so-called foreign invaders. In a lot of ways, they are as Indian as many Indian kings, even if the audiences that they're performing to. Now, we have to think one of the reasons why Mahmud was going out of his way to sack temples was obviously because he wanted the Islamic world to think, this guy is riding elephants and he's killing Muslims, which is very, very bad indeed, but he's also killing these infidels and he's destroying their temples, which is kind of good. So on balance, this guy he's all right. He's one of us, which is not something that Toramana, the Hun, is necessarily doing, but you have to recognize that these upstart military men, these basically criminals turned kings, aren't really that different from each other across time and space.
Yeah, Indian history is subject to some fairly terrible periodization. I think what you're saying illustrates is that partly the coming of the Turks is really part of a broader pattern of history of the subcontinent, where you've had armies of nomadic peoples enter the subcontinent, set up polities of their own, and that is also interacting with the coming of Islam. And it's really the interaction between these cultures, between these forces, with forces within the subcontinent, gradually creating a sort of new culture.
This new culture is so fascinating in so many ways. For example, when Mahmud is deciding which of his sons is going to succeed him, he makes the announcement by sending an elephant to the chosen son, which is, again, it's a remarkable degree of understanding of many royal traditions that this upstart family is trying to use to legitimize themselves, not just to audiences in the Islamic world, but also to Indian audiences, which is, it's complicated, basically.
Absolutely, it is very complicated, and it would require a fairly extraordinary personality like Mahmud to juggle all these complexities together. But of course, Mahmud was mortal like all of us, and he died barely 5 years after his triumphant raid on Somnath. And what follows is really a sort of long decline of the Ghaznavids. His son, like you pointed out, he appoints one of his sons as successor, but his twin brother and rival usurps him and takes over the throne. And you see a pattern over the next really 100 odd years of political chaos, really, which involves siblings, which involves members of the nobility. So out of about 15 odd sultans from this period, only 6 live out their time on the throne. The rest are either ousted or killed. Problems for the Ghaznavids are not just internal. They also have new challengers, both to the east and to the west. To the east, in the plains of India, you actually have these new powers that are actually going and harassing the Turks on the outskirts of their empire in Punjab.
Including one minor dynasty called the Chahamanas, who are famous with a much more familiar name, but we'll get back to them in the next part of this episode.
Yeah. The other, of course, great power are the Seljuk Turks. The Seljuk Turks have a sprawling empire that extends from Asia Minor, what we now call Turkey, all the way really up to the Caspian and the Oxus River.
So I mentioned Turkey in the beginning of this episode. The Seljuk Turks are the reason why it's called Turkey today, because these guys are so insanely successful. They managed to keep the Ghaznavids at bay or subjugate them or whatever and push down from Central Asia. Think of the geography that these guys are following, right? You're pushing down from the steppe of Central Asia across this great plateau of Iran, basically steamrollering all these other powerful polities that are fighting with each other, all these Muslim polities that are fighting each other. And you just keep pushing. You get into Mesopotamia, you get into Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey, and that's where the Seljuks defeated the Byzantine Empire in the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, which is easily one of the most pivotal battles in global history. It profoundly changes the way that the Near East is kind of governed, who's governing it. It leads directly or indirectly to the Crusades that happen. And it's quite interesting to see this movement happening from Central Asia towards the west of the world, when just a few decades ago we saw that movement happening from Central Asia east towards India. And I think that both of these have to be seen as part of a broader pattern within global history, which is not sufficiently appreciated, in my view.
Absolutely. I'm very glad you brought that up, Anirudh, because India is absolutely not unique in this. India is part of a global pattern where we see nomadic peoples and pastoral peoples during this time actually expanding into the spaces that sedentary empires and kingdoms control. And in fact, one of the other really interesting nomadic empires from this time are the Karakhitan. These are people who defy easy categorization. The Karakhitan may be related to the Mongols, who had not yet erupted out of the steppe. And the Karakhitan, just like how the Ghaznavids adopt Persian and Indian culture, the Karakhitan adapt a lot of Chinese characteristics in their courtly culture.
Fascinating.
Yeah. At the same time, they're ruling over an empire that is to a great extent sedentary, that is frequently Muslim. They themselves were either nominally Buddhists or followed their old pagan traditions. So this is a very multicultural, polyglot, multi-ethnic empire. And it's also militarily very powerful. The Karakhitan are your classic nomadic warriors. And when these guys expand, they send waves of refugees streaming into what is today Afghanistan. And among these are the people called the Ghuz Turks.
It's so interesting that the polity, the Ghaznavids, who had been responsible for spreading these waves of refugees into India, were themselves the victim of another wave of refugees that was being sent to them by an even bigger power that was rising in Central Asia.
But Anirudh, sometimes the great challenges actually come from the most unexpected places. We've been talking so far about the ascendancy of these nomadic empires and how actually their struggles between themselves affect the sedentary peoples. But there was throughout this time one sedentary peoples who would pose an astonishing challenge of their own. And these were the Ghoris. The Ghoris are people from central Afghanistan, not far from Herat. And these guys are the ultimate parvenus. Ghor is in the middle of nowhere. It's on the way to no place. In fact, in the early 11th century, a lot of the people there may not have actually even converted to Islam. They may have still been nominally Buddhists. And yet it's out of this backwater that you see a new force rise. The Ghors alternately pay tribute to the Ghaznavids as well as to the Seljuks. But they're biding their time. And their moment really comes during the reign of the Ghaznavi king Behram Shah, who's actually quite a character. Now, the clashes between the Ghaznavids and the Ghoris really take off during the time of the king Behram Shah, the Ghaznavi king. And this happens, and he's actually quite a distrustful man. When he's approached by two of the Ghori princes, he's actually pretty convinced that these guys are just scouting the city for a future raid. He tries to poison one of them. Then there's a battle. He's evicted. Eventually, he wins, and he apparently crucifies both these brothers.
Crucifies them? Oh God, I'm sure the rest of the Ghuris must have taken that wonderfully.
Yes, their brother Alauddin Hussain was absolutely thrilled, and he's set out to do battle with the Ghaznavis. Now, just think about this. The Ghaznavi Empire may be in decline, but it's still a really powerful kingdom, and it controls the military labor market of the area. These guys have access to cavalry. These guys have access to infantry. They have access to elephants. And yet, these Ghoris are willing to take them on. That really says something about who these guys are.
Says something about where they see their place in the world.
I think you get a sense of the attitude of the Ghoris when you read about how they did battle. Prior to their first battle, the Ghaznavis were actually boasting that they have elephants which would come and trample the Ghori armies. Now, the Ghorids themselves, these guys don't have a hell of a lot of cavalry on their own. They're primarily infantry, and they have these large shields which are made of oxhide and padded cotton, which, according to the chronicler Minhaj, can actually defend you from arrows. Before the very first battle began, you have a story again from Minhaj about two pehlwans or champions of the Ghoris who go out to kill two elephants. And the story goes that these guys actually slip under the bellies of these elephants and use sharp knives to cut open their bellies. One of them actually dies when the elephant collapses on him. So both him and the elephant die, and the other guy escapes.
This combination of both bravery and discipline, right? Because just having oxide shields isn't enough. When a bunch of cavalry archers is coming at you, your formation has to remain tight. You have to be able to hold tight even though you have these ululating hordes yelling at you and trying to force you to break your formation. So it's quite interesting how this mass discipline seems to be coupled with heroic courage in the way these Ghurids are fighting, especially considering that they're basically a sedentary state. These princes, lords of this tiny little area not too far from Ghazna, who seem to have worked with these bands of refugees who are coming into Central Asia, who are very clearly turning them into a sort of military machine. And what happens then? Do they go out and challenge the Ghaznavids?
Yes, so what happens after that is that the Ghaznavi cavalry, including 2 elephants, charges at these guys. And we're told that they open up their ranks. It's not clear what that exactly means, but they open up their ranks and are then able to surround this cavalry and slaughter it. Again, it's very difficult for us to reconstruct how these guys fight, but I'm constantly reminded of our previous episode about the warrior cultures of South India, where you have this combination of discipline and just ferocity. In fact, reminds you of Homer as well. But what we do know is that the Ghaznavis were defeated and they fled. And they tried to make a second stand and they were defeated again. And they tried to make a third stand and they were defeated yet again.
These are obviously very significant defeats. The major power of Afghanistan, arguably perhaps the southern part of Central Asia, has been defeated by essentially an upstart group of nobodies.
And now these nobodies, these parvenus, are inside the great city of Ghazni. And it's time for revenge. Alauddin Hussein again really shows us who he really is.
Or really who the Ghurids really are.
Who Ghurids really, exactly. They burned down the city, and the city supposedly sacked and pillaged and burnt for 7 whole days. The chronicler Minhaj again tells us that during these 7 days, the clouds of smoke so darkened the sky that the day seemed like night, and the flames so lighted the sky at night that the night looked like day. Now, obviously, this is poetic exaggeration, but it gives you a sense of how complete this destruction really was, or how complete they sought this destruction to be. They really wanted to destroy Ghazna as a power center permanently.
I have a quote here from Richard Eaton's India and the Persianate Age, which I reassure everybody I'm going to have a lot of very strong opinions on as this podcast progresses, but it got some useful factual information. So, on the destruction of Ghazna, I quote, "For 7 days Ghazni was plundered, with a reported 60,000 slain and many splendid palaces, schools and mosques destroyed, justly giving the Ghurid chieftain the sobriquet Jahansoz, one who sets the world ablaze."
And now guess what one who sets the world ablaze does? He gathers a bunch of noble prisoners, has them carry sacks of earth from Ghazna, takes them back to Ghurid lands, and supposedly has them slaughtered, and has their blood mixed with this mud, which is then baked into bricks to build structures in the Ghurid capital.
Oh my God, wow. This guy knew how to hold a grudge, evidently.
But of course, the Ghurids were still not powerful enough to hold Ghazna permanently at this time. And we talked about the convulsions with the Ghuz Turks pouring in. Now the Ghuz Turks go and take over Ghazna. And the Ghaznavid Empire, actually, such as it is now basically permanently based in Lahore. It's really a Punjabi empire now.
So the power that they had in Afghanistan at one point has now been totally smashed by the Ghurids, who are now rising very quickly to become the dominant powers of Afghanistan.
But eventually, as the Ghurids gain power, as they gain more allies in the region, they actually eventually take Ghazna permanently, driving out the Ghuz Turks. And at this moment, the Ghurids appoint 2 brothers to rule their new empire. The elder of these brothers is Ghiyatuddin Muhammad. The younger one is Muizuddin Muhammad, the man we know as Muhammad of Ghor. So as the elder brother turned west, Muizuddin would turn east. He would turn his energies towards what remained of the Ghaznavi Empire in Punjab. He would also have to look further east, because over there a new power was rising. Its great cavalry and infantry was expanding across North India. It knew how to fight the Turks. It's an empire that from contemporary sources we know of as the Chahmanas, but would be more familiar to our listeners today as the Chauhans.
Join us next week in the second part of this 2-part episode when we explore the second wave of Turkic invasions of North India in the 12th century, draw parallels between them and the crusades that were unfolding in West Asia at the same time, and most interestingly, plot out the deadly rivalries between these ambitious warlords that led to the establishment of one of the most significant and transformative polities in Indian history, the Delhi Sultanate. If you like this show, tell your friends about us and tell us what else you'd like to learn about India's violent, complicated history. Hit us up on Twitter or Instagram. Just search for our names. I'm Anirudh Kanisetti, that's Kanisetti.
And I'm Aditya Ramanathan, that's ADITYARAMANATHAN.
And tell us what you think of Yuddha. Tell us what you'd like to hear. And most importantly, don't forget to check out other interesting shows on the IVM network. And while you're at it, follow us on Twitter and Instagram at IVM Podcasts.
I hope you enjoyed that show. We'd like to thank our sponsors this week, HDFC Life and Paytm Money. Also, just a very quick note, I would really appreciate it if you guys could fill out a really short survey on our website. It's on ivmpodcast.com/survey. It's just a brand recognition survey for us to kind of work with the advertisers and give them some data. So it's a very short, less than 1 minute survey. Really appreciate your help in filling it out. And let me tell you a couple of things that you should check out this week. On Paperback, Rachita and Satyajit are joined by the host of Litnama, Lakshmi Krishnan. They talk about women's role in writing and fiction written by women. On The Habit Coach, we have a Women's Day special where Ashton talks about periods, PMS, PCOD, and other taboo subjects which shouldn't be taboo at all. On the Empowering series, Zarina is joined by actor Jim Sarb. They talk about the art of storytelling and his unconventional characters. On Agla Station Adulthood, Ayushi and Ritasha talk about coming of age and coming of age. On IVM Life, Ritika, Alika and Antarish welcome new producer at IVM, Sumit, to discuss their ultimate fantasy jobs. Don't miss Sumit's first ever recommendation on the show. Thanks and keep listening.
Do you wish you were smarter? Well, so do we. But the next best thing?
We could make you sound smarter.
And to help you with this endeavor, we are Simplified, a podcast that attempts to break down the complex world around you with a little knowledge, a lot of poor jokes, and a ton of random trivia.
Episodes out every Monday.
On the IVM Podcast app or wherever you get your podcasts.
See ya!